In this episode, a retiree is building his dream home, a place where he and his partner can live out the rest of their days, surrounded by some of Arizona's most peaceful wilderness. But he would never get to finish the construction as he had an unwelcome visitor join him for his morning coffee, a rendezvous that goes horribly wrong. Hit like and subscribe. This is Fierce. In the center of Arizona lies Yavapai County. There are 19 official wilderness areas within the county, with conifer forests and rocky outcrops, shaded creeks, and breathtaking canyons. Stephen Jackson had been retired for just over a year. He was looking forward to retirement, the freedom that it would bring him, and the adventures he could have. He had a plan, one that he was thinking about for a while now. He had fallen in love with a place called Groom Creek. It was a heavily forested area in Arizona's Yavapai County. He found a lovely plot of land for sale and bought it a few years back. Steve was a carefree man. He was instantly likable with an engaging presence and a broad knowledge on a range of subjects. He loved the outdoors. Groom Creek was the wilderness he had dreamt of, and he was going to share it with someone special, his long-term partner of 15 years, Annie Cooke. Stephen had decided to build them a house on his plot of land. It was going to be their retirement home, somewhere they could relax in amongst nature, surrounded by the wilderness that Arizona has to offer, somewhere they could grow old together. Stephen was building the cabin himself and spent his spare time during the final couple of years of his working life traveling from Tucson to work on the cabin. He would drive up in his camper van where he would sleep. In the days, he worked on the build. Although he worked alone, he was rarely alone. People would stop and chat with him. Sometimes his friends and neighbors would stay for hours talking with him. It was a lovely sunny morning, barely a cloud in the sky. Stephen awoke in his camper van early, the sun shining brightly through the windows of his vehicle. Before he set to work, Stephen set up his garden table and camping chair. He boiled the kettle on the stove and poured himself a cup of coffee. Making coffee first thing in the morning was a ritual that he did every single day of his life. His partner spoke of how he would always be the first up, the first to put the coffee on, and each morning she would wake to the smell of freshly brewed coffee. Sometimes Stephen would carry a mug up to Annie's bed and blow gently over the top of the cup, the smell of coffee waking her from her slumber, waking to Stephen's infectious smile. On that Friday morning, as Stephen sat down to drink his coffee amongst the pines, something moved in the surrounding trees. Stephen didn't have any food on or near him. He hadn't eaten breakfast. There was no trash left outside his cabin, and there wasn't an open water source nearby. Unbeknownst to Stephen, a predator was on the prowl. It was on the hunt, and it spotted the 66-year-old sitting in the shade, sipping his coffee, alone and vulnerable. When the bear was within meters of Stephen, it launched its attack, running at him from behind. Stephen didn't stand a chance. He would have felt the full force of the impact from behind him as the bear crashed into him. He flew off his chair and onto the ground, obviously uncertain of what had just happened. Then the bear jumped on top of him. It seemed like a desperate and frenzied attack. It was a male black bear, 7 to 10 years old. It wasn't a female protecting her cubs. It wasn't a male defending his territory. It was a male out for a kill. It grabbed Stephen by the head. He could feel the pressure of the jaws clamp down around his skull. He cried out for help. Would anybody hear him? He tried to push the bear away. He tried to get it to release his head from its mouth, but the bear was too strong. It had taken him completely by surprise. He hadn't been prepared for an attack on his own property. His desperate cries were heard by the neighbors. People rushed to his aid. People jumped into their cars and honked their horns. Others ran towards the bear, shouting at it in an effort to distract it. They tried anything to get the bear to release its grip on the man. The distractions did nothing to deter the bear. Instead, it dragged Stephen 75 feet down a bank and jumped on top of him. It mauled him over and over. With no options left, 2 of the witnesses ran to a neighbor's house. They banged on David Montano's door. It was just after 7 o'clock in the morning. David was still in bed. When he heard the relentless pounding on his front door, he knew something was wrong. The people of Groom Creek were a tight-knit community. They all knew each other. He flung back the cover and ran to the front door. Straight away, he was told to grab his gun, that there was a bear attacking Stephen. He ran to the safe, took out his rifle, and ran outside. He looked around for a moment and then spotted the bear. It was on top of Stephen. He could see the man underneath the 365-pound, 165-kilogram bear. He could see the sunlight shimmering off the bear's coat, its powerful front paws and sharp claws, its muzzle wet and red as it thrashed its head from side to side. He ran a little closer, immediately raised his rifle, and pulled the trigger. It was a clean shot. Instantly, the bear rolled off Stephen. In a single shot, the bear was dead. David took another shot, firing straight into the bear once more, just to make sure before running over to help Stephen. But when he got there, it was too late. The attack had been so brutal and so rapid that Stephen had already died from his injuries. There was nothing David could do. The close-knit community, who had each sought out the quiet life in the peaceful countryside of Groom Creek, were shattered. They were heartbroken for their new neighbor. He was so well-liked, and they all knew how much he was looking forward to settling in there, how excited he was to start living the dream with his partner. Some members of the community said that following the attack, some of the peace that came from living amongst nature had been taken away. The locals all look out for each other now. They all have each other's contact details and phone numbers. When they leave their houses, they carry with them bear spray and air horns. They don't feel as safe anymore. The attack has had a massive impact on their lives. David, who had lived in the area for 7 or 8 years, said that it was rare to see a bear up there. Since 1990, when records of bear attacks began, there have been just 15 attacks on people. 2 of these, including Stephen's, were fatal. The sheriff's office was called out to the scene at around 7:50 a.m. Wildlife experts took the bear away to examine it. Maybe they could find some answers as to why this exceedingly rare attack took place. At first glance, the bear looked healthy, but could more detailed analysis reveal the cause for its aggression? It was tested for rabies, but the test came back negative. It had a good layer of fat on it, suggesting that it was nutritionally healthy too. There were no signs of disease. When its stomach contents were examined, there was plenty of native vegetation and seeds found inside, so it had a good source of food and had no trouble in finding it. Officials concluded that the attack had been a predatory one. It was an incredibly rare thing to have happened, and Stephen did absolutely nothing wrong to entice the bear to the area or provoke it in any way. It was a tragic end to his life, a life that he and Annie were so looking forward to enjoying together. Annie said that the pain of his loss is so consuming at times. She will never again wake to the smell of freshly brewed coffee made by the man she loved. Life in Alaska's frozen wilderness can be tough. For the few that call the remoteness home, there is no better place on Earth. The beauty of the unspoiled landscape, surviving off the land, living amongst nature, the solitude and the peace that it offers. To some, it's a dream. For others, it would be hell on earth, a place where temperatures can dip lower than -73 Celsius or -100 Fahrenheit, where for months at a time the sun doesn't shine and winds can blast through the region at 60 miles per hour. Where this encounter takes place, the nearest road is 80 miles away, and civilization, the city of Fairbanks, is 500 miles away. For Sue Aikens, this was a life she chose, to be able to fend for herself and introduce her kids to some of nature's most beautiful landscapes. Her job was working alone in an isolated plane refueling station in Kavik. She maintained the small airstrip and owns the Kavik River Camp. This offers explorers and adventurers a base from which to explore and experience the Alaskan wild. Her guests include scientific researchers, eco-tourists, and hunters. She operates a B&B from the camp, which she runs from June to September. For the rest of the year, Sue lives alone, hunting and fishing to survive the harsh winters, collecting water from the nearby river, maintaining the airstrip, and remaining vigilant. There is a constant threat from grizzly bears. Sue claims that there are 80 collared bears within 10 miles of her home. She notes that there are even more uncollared ones. Living in such an inhospitable environment amongst some of North America's most dangerous land predators, Sue always predicted she'd have an encounter with one. So when it happened one year, she kind of expected it. Sue's job for the day was to collect water from the river. It was about to freeze over solid, and then it would be difficult to collect. So Sue knew that she had to gather as much as possible before the big freeze. She was on her last run of the day. She had seen a grizzly bear in the vicinity in the preceding days. She had watched from the safety of her home as he buried reindeer carcasses nearby. The area was a landing pad for helicopters. It had to be kept clear. As Sue ventured outside her accommodation, she scanned the surrounds. The snow was glistening in the sunshine. The tundra was blanketed in a thick layer of snow. Everything was icy. Everything was frozen and cold. She walked to the river, carrying with her the water pump. The snow crunched underfoot. The icy wind blew. She needed to place the water pump into the water before turning it on. Then it would pump out river water back to her station effortlessly. To do this, she needed to use two hands. She carried her rifle with her. It was her only form of protection against bears. There was no sign of the eager-looking juvenile she had seen previously. She placed her rifle on the ground and heaved the heavy pump into the water. But the bear was there. He had been hiding, obscured by a dip in the riverbank. Sue had walked almost straight on top of him. He spotted her immediately and leapt up the bank. Sue had little time to react. Her rifle lay on the snow feet from where she now stood. Before she could grab it, before she could do anything, the bear jumped onto her. It pinned her to the ground with its immense strength and brute force and dragged her along the ground. Sue had been expecting this. Perhaps not that day, perhaps not that second, but she knew one day a bear would get her. It was almost inevitable living in that environment. She summoned all her training and all her knowledge. There was no use fighting back. The bear was way too powerful for her. There was no way she could reach her gun. Instead, she had to relax and not fight back. She tried not to make a sound. She just braced herself. Sue closed her eyes and waited. She could feel the bear bite down onto her skull. She thought it was going to crack. She thought it was going to give in. Then the bear thrashed her helpless body around from side to side. She was thrown like a rag doll, tossed into the snow where she lay unmoving. When Sue didn't move, when she didn't scream or squeal, the bear retreated into the water. She couldn't see the extent of her injuries. She could just feel an intense pain in her hips and on her head. She needed to remain still for a little while longer, but she also needed to remain conscious. She just hoped she wasn't bleeding out. Although Sue didn't know it at the time, the attack had dislocated both of her hips. Despite this, and against all odds, she managed to get to her feet and grab her rifle. She made it back to the dining hall, the nearest building to her. Once inside, she grabbed the radio and made an urgent call to state troopers. There was no answer. When she called them by phone, it rang and rang until the answering machine clicked on. She left a message to say that she had been attacked by a bear. She later learned that when the troopers heard her message, they assumed the bear had just ransacked the camp. She had sounded so calm that they had no idea she had been attacked. With nobody answering her calls, nobody knew she was in trouble. Nobody knew she was in desperate need of medical attention. But Sue knew the bear still posed a threat. There was no way that he would leave the area. He wouldn't leave her alone. And whilst he remained in the area, he posed a continual threat. It was a case of him or her. By now, Sue could tell her hips were dislocated. The joints were unstable and the pain was incredible. Luckily, Sue was tough, very tough. She cleaned her open wounds and sewed them up herself. She had a first aid kit which she used to patch herself up. She knew that the bears knew she was in there. They would be able to smell the blood, the scent of wounded prey. Sue wouldn't be able to protect herself with her injuries unless she helped herself to heal. She located the bear a little distance away. She raised the gun and fired a shot. The bear dropped down dead. On her way back to her accommodation, her hips gave out. She slumped to the icy ground. With the camp still yards away, Sue had to drag herself through the snow. It was agonizingly slow, but somehow she made it. With no one answering her calls and the troopers failing to show up because they didn't think anything was wrong, Sue was left severely injured and all alone. After a day or two, she heard a plane flying overhead. She thought she had been saved. She knew the pilot. She knew all the pilots, as she was the only refueling station for miles and miles. When he landed, he found Sue inside. She was in a bad way. He helped clean her up and then flew her to a hospital in Fairbanks. She was then transferred to Portland for spinal surgery. Sue went on to make a full recovery, but the attack is something that has stayed with her. She has never left Kavik River Camp in the Alaskan wilderness. Several years later, National Geographic made a documentary, Life Below Zero, about individuals living in Alaska's frozen north. It details the harsh environment in which these people live, and Sue has one of the starring roles.